Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Outen, and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's virtual authors talk. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions, and other historical programs, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark finished in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. Tonight's authors talk features Dr. Hannah Farber, who will discuss her recently published book, Underwriters of the United States, How Insurance Shaped the American Founding. Unassuming but formidable, American maritime insurers used their position at the pinnacle of global trade to shape the new nation. As Hannah Farber demonstrates in her recent book, the international information insurers gathered and the capital they generated enabled them to play central roles in state building and economic development. During the American Revolution, they helped the new nation negotiate foreign loans, sell state debts, and establish a single national bank. Afterward, they increased their influence by lending money to the federal government and to its citizens. Even as the federal and state governments began to encroach on their domain, maritime insurance adapted, preserving their autonomy and authority through extensive involvement in the formation of commercial law. Leveraging their claims to unmatched expertise, they operated free from government interference while simultaneously embedding themselves into the nation's institutional fabric. Hannah Farber is an assistant professor of history at Columbia University. Her research focuses on politics and economy in colonial North America, the early American Republic, and the Atlantic world. Her first book, Underwriters of the United States, How Insurance Shaped the American Founding, was published in November of 2021 by the Alejandro Institute of Early American History and Culture and the University of North Carolina Press. Professor Farber holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and is a series editor of American Beginnings, 1500 through 1900, at the University of Chicago Press. She also held a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the New York Historical Society during 2020 to 2021. Now, before I turn things over to Dr. Farber, there are a few housekeeping items that are in order. Following this evening's talk, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Farber using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function. And one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hannah Farber.
Thanks so much to the Institute for having me. Thank you to Andrew for that lovely introduction. And thanks to all you audience members for coming out from all of these different places to your living room rectangles on a weekday evening to hear a talk with insurance in the title. I'll try my best to make it worth your time. I'm going to share some slides with you as we move forward. All right. So what is this book actually about? Some of the things that I tell people when they try to figure out why I wrote a book about insurance, when there are so many other exciting things to talk about from the era of the American Revolution. Here's some of the things that I say. I say this book is about finance in the age of the American founding. I say this book is about how a powerful old international business comes to terms with a fragile new republic and bets on it. And it's also a story about how economic risk-taking and political risk-taking are intertwined in ways that aren't necessarily immediately obvious, especially if what you're familiar with is sort of the traditional story of the sort of the risks and dangers of American independence from a military point of view, a naval point of view, the point of view of the potential failure of political systems. We don't always think about how that's connected to the financial world, and insurance as this really complicated, highly capitalized business run by expert merchants is a really, really interesting way into this story. So I did not go to graduate school thinking that I was going to write about anything economic related. I was looking for stories of swashbuckling adventure on the high seas and the young republic and adventures of this kind, and was originally just struck by how often when you're reading the papers of a merchant or even a privateer from the American Revolution or from especially the 1790s, 1800s, you come across references to insurance. I was looking for adventure and I found insurance everywhere. So insurance does not have a real intense presence in the physical landscape of the early American Republic, and that's part of the story too. It's not that visible to the public, but if you know where to look, you start to see it everywhere. Like I said, in merchant papers, but also in things like city directories here on the left. The Boston Directory of 1807 tells a visitor all of the things that they might want to know about the city of Boston, starting with like its latitude and its longitude. They list the number of churches and what kind of churches they are, and they list the number of banks and the number of insurance companies in Boston here on page 6. So somehow the author of this guidebook has come to believe that how many insurance companies a city has and how much capital they hold would be a really important or interesting thing for a visitor to know. You also see a lot of insurance in port city newspapers. Insurers advertised their company elections when they elected new directors. They advertised their dividends, which was a good way of showing the public how profitable they were. Sometimes they wanted to say that, and sometimes they didn't want to say that so loudly. And interestingly, sometimes insurers advertise or is advertised what the insurance rates are for American vessels headed to various places in the world. And this is a more politically salient story here summed up in this little chart than we might at first think, because the business of marine insurance in this time period, the insurance of commercial shipping, is not really so much about the risk of hitting a rock or the risk of a hurricane, although those things are important too. But the rates on those kinds of things are pretty low. The insurance rates for a voyage across the Atlantic in the immediate post-revolutionary period is just a couple of percent. But the reason that insurance rates vary so much on commercial cargoes is political unrest. So a set of insurance premiums is really a snapshot of insurers' impressions of how safe Americans are in the world, about how dangerous it is for Americans with this new country who desperately need their ventures to stay afloat. How much are they going to have to pay to keep themselves safe as they're trying to get their ships to their destination? So it turned out that insurance is a war story after all. American insurance brokerages, even in the 18th century, before independence, multiplied during war times. So the first significant number of American insurance brokerages in British North America appear during the 7 Years' War. Insurance brokerages also become quite active during the American Revolution, and I'll talk about that in a bit. The really big growth in the US insurance sector comes during the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, which raged around the world on the oceans between 1792-ish and 1815-ish. France declares war on the rest of Europe and vice versa. The United States is not directly involved as a formal combatant for most of the time, right, until the War of 1812 breaks out. And these wars pose an existential threat to the new United States, but they make the American insurers of commercial shipping extraordinarily powerful. The reason is that this is a high risk, high reward climate for American commercial shipping. So traders, what does the United States have a lot of when it becomes an independent country? They have a lot of land, right? Although they don't know, it's not quite monetizable yet. but everybody agrees that must be worth something. But more immediately, the United States has a really outsized commercial fleet. And not only is that crucial for the country's economic development, it's also crucial for the functioning of the government, because the federal government is almost completely dependent on customs revenue to run its operations for, really through the end of the 19th century, through the beginning of the 20th century. So the Napoleonic Wars offer enormous opportunities for traders who are willing to take the risk on using these ships to head to blockaded ports, to war-starved ports, to ports that are sort of, to French islands that have grown a lot of sugar, but they can't seem to get that sugar past British naval blockades. So the United States is poised to take advantage of this. But trade is risky, and the United States has almost no naval defense. So it's a growing sector of insurers. And I should emphasize that insurers are always merchants themselves. At least the heads of insurance companies have to be merchants, because only merchants understand what merchants do, and only expert merchants who become insurers are sort of can mentally process what it is that that American merchants are going through. I'll talk about that more in a second. But so the merchant insurers help American merchants pool their risks and navigate this high risk, high reward landscape. And especially beginning in the 1790s, American merchants form large numbers of insurance corporations to help pool and manage their risks. So again, this isn't even just a story about wars and peace, the ends of wars, because if you're on the ground, you might just better understand this Napoleonic period as trouble, as miscellaneous political dangers of delays, dangers of these like hungry privateers who might, war might not have formally broken out quite yet, but maybe you'll take your chances. Maybe war is over, but you can, capture anybody and see what's going on. There is quasi-war, there's hostility, there's confusion and delay. All of these things are things you're going to want to insure against: delays, inconveniences, legal matters. So this is the context in which American insurers become incredibly important for the American mercantile sector, and thus for the country as a whole. So let me just back up for a second and just say a little bit more about what kind of insurance this is exactly. So the people in my book really only think about marine insurance, the insurance of commercial shipping, and fire insurance. So life insurance has started in London, for example, but it doesn't really register for them here in early America. Life insurance doesn't become a big thing in the United States until the mid-19th century. And fire insurance doesn't take in that much money. You can sort of start a fire insurance company and people can buy your company's shares, but a fire insurance policy just isn't going to earn you much money. The insurance policies for fire insurance cost, a few dollars, and they last a number of years. Whereas an insurance policy on a commercial voyage could be a lot of money real quickly. So it's this big business. A commercial voyage could be, you can insure $1,000 at a time, $2,000 at a time. And insurance premiums can be, as little as 2 or 3% during peacetime or for a short coastal voyage. Or I've seen insurance rates up to 75% on a really risky voyage. And you might think that's ridiculous. Like, what's the point of running a voyage if your insurance rate is 75%? Well, if you can charge 500% markup if your ship gets through, then that might in fact be very much worth it to you. Or if you own shares in that insurance company that's insuring you, then you're sort of hedging your bets. You might win either way. So marine insurance is a very unusual business. It's a very old business. It's a business that starts in its modern form in Renaissance Italy, and it's designed precisely to handle politically unsettled conditions like the ones faced by the Italian city-states in the Renaissance, like Genoa, like Venice, places like that, places where merchants need to be able to make binding deals with each other in climates of extreme uncertainty across political boundaries. And so the practice of marine insurance, how does it work? Because of this political fragmentation, people don't really learn how insurance works from their own country's laws. They learn about how insurance works from books that merchants write for other merchants, and they call these books often compilations called The Laws of Merchants. A merchant's directory, merchant's handbook. It's this body of knowledge that has some laws in it, mishmashes of laws, sets of customs, customary procedures, which sometimes which bind insurers and merchants together. Both insurers and merchants have to know how insurance works according to the laws of merchants in order for this whole system to work for them. So under the laws of merchants, so all of these books have like big fat chapters on marine insurance and how it works. You can go look them up on, some of them are on Google Books. You can look some of them up right now if you want. Merchants and insurers have this sort of reciprocal power over each other under the laws of merchants. The merchant customer is under the power of the insurer, just like you are under the power of your insurer today, in the sense that if you don't follow the agreed upon terms of your deal with the insurer, then the insurer is not going to indemnify you in case of loss. But the insurer is also vulnerable to the merchant customer. That's because one of the ways that this business is so quirky. So the custom of insurance, according to these books, is that the merchant is not obligated to inform his insurer of everything the insurer is already supposed to know. And what does that mean? Well, sort of the laws of merchants tell you, sort of they don't. But if you're a merchant, you're just sort of supposed to know. You're supposed to know what's a safe route and what's not, what proper paperwork looks like. You're supposed to know which kinds of port officials you're supposed to bribe and which kinds of port officials you're not supposed to bribe. The sort of the vibe is that the insurer is like spiritually on board the voyage. He's sharing the risk. In spirit, he's there. He's got to know everything. So the point of all this is that both insurers and merchants that they insure have to know a lot of stuff that you don't learn in your country. You learn it from other merchants. So merchants are sort of organizing each other's behavior through this practice of early modern insurance. All right, so what happens when your insurance business meets the United States? Like I said, there have been insurance brokerages since the mid-18th century. They tend to surge in numbers during wartime when more people want insurance. More people want to underwrite, actually, during wartime a lot of the times because you can charge higher premiums. So insurance becomes more of a gambler's business during wartime, high risk, high reward. So you see surges like in Philadelphia during the 7 Years' War, especially. During the American Revolution, the surge of insurance brokerages and insurance business becomes really politically salient for British North American colonists. I would say for the first time. Like before the revolution, Americans are sort of indifferent. They can get their insurance from Lloyd's of London. They can get their insurance from old, well-established commercial centers like Amsterdam, places where there are other expert merchants and really functional, efficient financial markets where you can get a better deal on insurance. During the war, this sort of sets of expert knots of American merchants become more active in insuring one another. They insure one another just simply because of the risk of voyages during wartime. But insurers during the American Revolution also become part of the offense against Britain in ways that are really interesting. You can insure your privateering voyage if you would like to do that during the American Revolution, which is sort of mind-bending. They charge these very high insurance rates, but it's these same groups of guys who are launching privateering voyages and also insuring one another's privateering voyages. It's just another way of communally managing this high risk, high reward financial landscape. Insurance is also relevant to the United States when they go on offense during the Revolutionary War, because the United States doesn't have much of a formal navy. So the way that some of you probably know these stories a lot better than I do even, a lot of the ways that Americans feel like they can go on offense during the war is by privateering, by capturing British commercial vessels. And so they really like to hear about when they've captured, when John Paul Jones captures a bunch of British commercial vessels, and they hear that insurance rates on British vessels at Lloyd's, the rates have really gone up for British vessels at Lloyd's. They're like, yes, like this is how we know we're doing well in the war. Like there's a number we can put on this now. And this is demoralizing. This is embarrassing for Britain when insurance rates go up. We really showed them, we made it somewhat harder for their merchants to launch commercial voyages, but it is really relevant. Another way that insurance is discussed during the Revolutionary War is because there's some concern about the ways that the high cost of insurance is contributing to the high prices of goods that Americans have to pay during the Revolutionary War, the high prices of imported goods. Merchants say, hey, it's not that we're gouging our customers, it's that we have to pay all this money to insurers. So if we're going to operate, we have to pass those costs on to our customers. We promise we're not cost gouging, price gouging. What they don't say is that a lot of them are insurers as well. So either way, they're passing costs on to their customers. Still, the big transition is not really with the revolution. It's really a little later when two things happen. One is the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars. Again, this high risk, high reward commercial environment for American shippers. And secondly, when the stigma against corporations starts to subside in American political life. There had been a sort of feeling, a sort of association of corporations with like the British East India Company that foisted all this horrible tea on Americans and made them have this revolution in the first place, or the South Sea Company, which was this notorious story of bubble and bust from the 1720s. So Americans have to come around to the idea that corporations can be local, that they can be okay in a republic. There are still anti-corporate people, there always are, but in general, state legislatures find that it's easy to stop fighting about corporations by giving everybody a corporation who wants a corporation, and then they all have corporations and they don't have to too much fight about it. The interesting thing about corporations then is that they accumulate capital and they have to invest this capital somewhere. And American insurance companies in particular have to invest because they have to stay liquid enough to pay the claims of their customers during this very hot period of the French Revolutionary Wars. They can't buy land, they're not allowed to anyway. They're not allowed to invest overseas, that's very politically dicey. So insurance companies invest huge chunks of money in banks with which they're closely connected. I'd be happy to talk about that later. Strangely, this is like an amazing part of my story, and nobody ever asked me long questions about how insurance and banking are connected. I was trying to get an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about this, and the Wall Street Journal was like, literally, this is too recondite a topic for us. And I was like, really? The interconnection of insurance and banking? You don't think that's something that we should talk about more? But anyway, clearly that doesn't trouble me at all. In any case, what corporations do is allow insurers to invest in the United States. They buy a lot of federal securities. So they're not only betting on the United States by securing American merchant commerce. These growing numbers of American insurance companies are also investing in the state. They're buying US securities. They're taking American risks in that way as well. And this ends up being a lot of money. And so this is one of the charts I made for this book. The top dotted line is how much capital there is in American banks, as far as I could calculate it over this period that I study. The lower line that's growing more steadily is the amount of capital in insurance companies. Not as much as banks, certainly not, but a really astonishing fraction of this overall sum of financial capital in the United States, considering how little the insurance capital gets talked about. I mean, it really manages to stay behind the scenes a lot more than banking capital does. If you look at the number of insurance companies operative in the United States compared to banks, then the tracking together is even more striking. So these are really, they're cousin institutions. They're deeply interconnected, and these are institutions that are like coagulating and domesticating a lot of capital and investing it in the country itself. So these new cohort of American insurers, in constant conversation with their overseas counterparts, have this mindset that their staggeringly complex and lucrative business was their own, and that it could not be managed or controlled by the United States. There's some sense to this. This business is really complicated. When during the revolution, there's this sort of wave of interest in, I don't want to say populist exactly, but in democratic control over the legal system. And there's an attempt to make insurance law cases subject to the decisions of citizen jurors. And it's an absolute disaster. Like, American citizens do not understand how insurance works. And this becomes a debacle, and they back away from it. So American insurers are right that their business is very complicated. It's very intricate, and it's not something that your average Joe can just walk in and necessarily have opinions about it. Insurers also know things. They know things about how global commerce is going that the early US government just doesn't know because it's so vestigial. So they're really powerful information aggregators because they talk to each other. They have this constant correspondence with merchants overseas and with ship captains, and they become hubs of commercial information that quickly makes them politically really significant. So, when Jefferson's administration is trying to decide whether they should go to war with Britain, or, maybe we should go to war with France too in the early 1800s, who knows? We're fed up with all these foreigners. They have to ask the insurance companies, how many American ships are being captured by foreign powers? Because they don't know. The insurance companies do. So, as I said, the way that I think about this is that the underwriters are betting on the United States, like I said, by investing in federal securities, by underwriting US trade. They're sharing their information with the US government. And they also do other nice, useful things for the US government. They avow their loyalty to the government, by sort of expressing their own confidence in the United States. That's a form of security as well that they can offer the United States. If they can say, they're betting with their dollars that they believe in American commerce, that has some value in this world where the United States is, in some sense, a post-colonial power that's very much in debt to foreign powers, and foreign financiers are watching very closely to see how the country is doing. So when underwriters are participating in making the United States financially functional, when it's contributing to merchant safety in the world, the underwriters really are doing some things for the country. They largely follow the law, with some exceptions I'll be happy to talk about. They largely ensure that their merchant customers do the same. All right, so this is where I sort of start talking about the payoff and other aspects of the story that I'd be happy to answer questions about. So one of the ways that insurers get paid off for their bet on the United States is simply through the dividends that their companies generate. And these dividends are really extraordinary. So here is some data that I have gathered, you can see insurance, it is not at all uncommon for insurance companies to return like every 6 months dividends that bounce up and down, but a 15% return on your investment, a 20% return on your investment. It's almost like corporations in the age of Zoom and COVID, right? The Columbia University endowment just went up 30% this past year. So we're all kind of taking stock of what those numbers mean. But at any rate, this is a huge amount of money that is being accumulated and returned to shareholders during this period of extreme political and commercial uncertainty. I think it's interesting to compare those dividends to the dividends returned by American banks, which, this is, I would say this is not a bad dividend rate either, but it's a lot steadier. Expectations are lower risk, lower reward. Another way that I talk about one of the returns that insurance companies get for betting on the United States is that they get chartered. They get charters from the states to incorporate. They get those charters renewed. And chartering offers them this legal and political and cultural security. And they're very conscious about this, right? They say they understand that they're investing in the United States. They're investing in state debt, although there doesn't turn out to be that much of that in this period, but they didn't know that. And what they get back is the state is sort of giving them this imprimatur that says insurance is a valuable and important business, and it's something that American citizens could invest in, that they should support. Insurance companies also pay very little tax during this period, and they're also able to significantly shape the American legal system in a way that suits their interests. So in broad strokes, American insurers opt to shoulder some of the Republic's risks, and they receive in turn a national infrastructure that suits their interests nicely. I talk in the book about other ways insurance companies secure themselves and secure their own safety, right? So these are corporations and brokerages that are in the business of taking risk. How do they make themselves stable? I talked about incorporation just now. They collaborate extensively with one another. They're always sort of checking on each other to see how do you handle this situation, or what rate do you charge? So it becomes a very interconnected industry. They have these close relationships with banks. I also, quite frankly, think that coming across as boring is a powerful strategy that they use. And I've actually seen this play out in requests for corporate charters, when sometimes state legislatures are worried that people who want corporate charters are basically just high rollers, right? They're looking to pump and dump stock. They're trying to make a big pile of capital to do whatever with. But what marine insurance incorporators can do is say, no, we're just part of this really old seafaring tradition. We're not in this to accumulate capital. We're providing this really important service for American merchants. So there's this amazing series of letters in 1825 where a prospective incorporator who's he's like a sea captain, and he goes to Albany to try to get a company charter. And he literally says, I pass myself off as a guileless seafaring gentleman. He's very much taken on this insurer strategy of acting like they're not in politics, acting like, this is just this thing that we do to help merchants, and there is no need to worry about the fact that we also sit on a giant pile of capital. And the state legislators get bored of him talking about his old sea salt stories, and they're like, okay, you can go. And then he gets his incorporation, and they do very well. Coming across as very complicated and important. I talked about this too, but fundamentally, insurers like to have it both ways. When they're in a climate where they're making money, well, they like to talk about themselves as objective risk assessors who should not be touched or controlled by political actors, because they're just going to ruin it. And you shouldn't interfere with them, like say Jefferson's embargo. They wouldn't like that, because that's making decisions for them about what trade should or shouldn't happen. People are saying, no, let's just let the insurance companies decide. On the other hand, when things get too hot for the insurers, they run to the government and they say, you're our government, we're American citizens, this is American property, you have to sponsor more naval ships, you have to give us compensation for political things that have gone down overseas that I can talk about. So sometimes they talk about themselves as independent of the state, and sometimes they talk about themselves as these like essential civic institutions. Sometimes, quite frankly, they break the law. They insure illegal voyages. This insurance policy is in the book. It's a policy that Mr. Jonathan Dorr and Company of Boston says he's buying on behalf of someone else. But you can see he didn't even bother to fill out the name of this pretend foreign person that he's getting insurance for. So this is insurance for a voyage that American merchants are not supposed to make. During the War of 1812. Jonathan Dorr is doing it anyway, but he's saying, no, it's not my ship that's being insured. It's foreigner squiggly line here, right? Like everybody knows what he's doing. And on the back of this policy, which I don't have here, that you can see he does lose the ship, and the indemnification is to Mr. Jonathan Dorr of Boston. So of course they're skirting the law, but people are not making too much of a big deal out of it because it's hard to understand what insurers are doing. I said insurers also help make the law. They are the only ones who understand the customary practice of the business, so they're very influential in forging an American version of commercial law. All right, so to conclude, one of the big stories of this book is how insurers took on the risk of the new United States in a variety of ways and were rewarded. My book thinks about the American Revolution in the context of global financial systems. And what I said here is like the money guys are there from the beginning of the country, for better or for worse. This is not a pro-insurance book. This is not an anti-insurance book. It's not a pro-finance book. It's not an anti-finance book. It's a book that says, look, here is a whole complicated financial system that's already in existence when the United States comes into being. And there are some books these days that really see and feel the American Revolution as a moment of potentially radical economic remaking, I think. And I do feel that the insurance story in some way argues against that, because you have so much that's already in place at the time the United States comes into being. The underwriters, domestic and foreign, who have taken on the risk of the United States, some significant part of this financial world is really locked into place. So on the bright side, I don't think that it makes sense later on to talk about a sort of a declension from a moment of noble radical possibility in the American Revolution, because some of these finance systems are really there already from the beginning. And I'd be happy to talk about that more. And my third sort of contemporary conclusion is that if there's one, I hate drawing contemporary conclusions. I'm really bad at it. I think you should draw your own conclusions. But the one thing that I've been thinking about is that governments are always in the business of risk management. Even if that risk is only the risk of like foreign invasion, right? We're all paying a lot of money right now in our taxes so that the government can spend that money on defense, on risk management. We are in a world where risks like climate change and COVID are these sort of massive new considerations. I'm not sure that Americans today are that great at thinking or talking about the way that risk is allocated and who is paying to manage that risk. And I don't preach the answers, right? But I want us to be able to see the insurance systems, because whether public or private or interconnected, which is what they really are, because I think that the first step to making the world how we want it is to consciously think about how risks are being managed by citizens now, by corporations now, by governments now, and to put all of those kinds of stories together. And so since governments are always explicitly or implicitly in the business of risk management, when you change insurance, when you change the way that insurance works, you've really changed the way the country works, whether you think of it that way or not. So that's most of what I have here. I'm happy to take some questions. I put up some other things that I'd be happy to talk about. Insurance and the laws of merchants. We can talk more about that. We can talk about the material life of the insurance company, wax seals and silver chalices. We can talk about landscapes, more about the revolution. We can talk about privateers and Algerian corsairs. We can talk about the slave trade, or I'd be happy to go back and forth with you about other contemporary connections. So I'm open here. Andrew is in charge of asking me the questions, I think. So I know we're going to at least 7:30 and then after that at his discretion. So once again, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure coming to see you tonight.
Well, thank you, Dr. Farber. Very interesting. I'm going to start off by, I know you at the beginning of your talk, you gave us a little bit of background about the inspiration for writing the book. Now, can you shed some light on the research process? Because that had to have been very, very tedious.
So I wouldn't have started this if it hadn't actually been so interesting. So the place that I actually spent most time was the Massachusetts Historical Society, which has this giant set of books that and correspondence belonging to the Boston Marine Insurance Company, founded in 1799. And I didn't start with the numbers because I didn't know how to read them then, but I started with the letter books and just the incredibly political, complex, swashbuckling stories that the insurance company was managing and keeping up with. They were writing letters to British admiralty judges to find out how they would rule on certain matters of commercial property and its legality. They were litigating cases in foreign courts. They were coordinating rates and decisions with other insurance companies. They were issuing enormous dividends. So all of that became more comprehensible at first through the letters, through how they talked about what they did. And then you can sort of start to see a difference between what they do publicly and a little bit what they talk about privately, because both merchants and insurers will talk very loudly, rather like corporations today, when they're in distress, when there's a disaster, when they want help. And then when things are going well, they don't tend to put that forward so much. So then I looked to see, whether other corporations had papers around the country that worked the same way, and indeed they did. I looked at brokerages to see if they looked the same way. I looked at the newspapers to see how insurance appeared in those newspapers, tried to see if they were in political and legal discourse, really not so much. But there was just so much money in this business that I was convinced that there had to be a big story there. So I guess I followed the money, and I did so with the commitment that I wouldn't only tell a story that made sense to economists. It wasn't just a story about financial institutional forms or about data sets and about that kind of change, but to really understand this as the intensely political world it was, a world in which politics and culture shape value. Even as, I'm not saying money is pretend, right? These ships are really coming in, they really have valuable stuff on them, but it's that dance between the political, cultural, and the economic world that really kept me going.
Wow, fascinating. We did have a question. Was there a specific point in the war where people started betting on the Continentals or the Americans winning? Was, for example, did the French alliance have an impact on that at all? Or could you talk more to that point?
I would love to say that I could see a big turning point in the data, but the decisions that insurance companies, or in this time mostly brokerages, not corporations, they were so specific, they were so locally negotiated, that it's hard to see that particular transition happening. You definitely see toward like 79, insurance rates go way up, like during years and for ventures that were particularly risky for Americans. And then you see rates go significantly down at the end of the war. I tried to find a big turning point in the data, but it's sort of fragmentary and I couldn't. There is one satisfying turning point in the book regarding some moment in the Napoleonic Wars where all of a sudden the insurers decide that ventures to certain Caribbean islands are like a lot more risky, and you can see the rates go up like that. Or really, it's more interesting than that, because first they spike like crazy. There's like really high, there's like someone who buys insurance way too much. I don't know why, he pays way too much. He should have said no and walked away, because a couple of weeks later the rates go down and they sort of stabilize at the new higher point again. So you can't quite tell the turning point of the war itself, but you see people thinking about insurance all the time. Like Robert Morris is thinking about like who's going to pay, when he's buying arms, war material from Europe, he's like, who's going to pay to insure this? these ships full of gunpowder, whatever they're shipping to the Americans, this is a big question, not just whether a foreign power will ship us this stuff, but who's going to pay to insure it, because that's going to be really expensive.
Absolutely. Now, we do have a few questions about privateers.
Sure.
Did they have access? You mentioned at the beginning that the Americans didn't have a navy, but they did have privateers. Now, what was their access like?
So privateers. So some American merchants, right, lend their ships to the war effort, and so those become ships that voyage, that fight at the public's risk. So in one way, this is a really cool way of seeing a country come into being, is when does the United States like have its own risk account, a conceptual thing, right? Conceptually, once it's the rebelling states that are taking on the risk of fighting the war, that's like a really transformational moment in some ways. That's when it, like I said, in some ways, that's when it becomes a government, is when it takes on a public risk of a newly conceived American public. So some privateers, so in that sense, the United States becomes the insurer for some of these privately owned ships during the war. The privateers who are poaching British commercial ships are also sometimes underwritten. Sometimes a ship will have like a privateering license. It'll be mostly going on a commercial voyage, but it'll also have some arms, and they'll say, whatever happens, maybe we'll catch something juicy along the way to our destination. And so they are usually paying hefty insurance rates because these are significant risks that they're taking. But if they get something yummy, then the insurance company is going to be happy as well. And often it's these same little clusters of privateers who are insuring one another.
Okay. Now there is a question: how did insurers mitigate against fraud this time?
So again, it's an interesting question. Part of it is communal trust, because on balance, the port cities are not that big still, and people tend to know each other. Captains are often known by name, so you know if somebody is like a drunk or not, and you might have heard of even the name of somebody's ships. So it's partly reputational, partly people can't, they're not that mobile. It's not that easy to disappear if you're a port city merchant and you want to keep being a port city merchant. Part of it is expertise based. Like I said, insurers, so the heads of insurance companies or big underwriters, expert brokers have to have extensive mercantile experience so that they can see, I guess we would say now, if something passes the smell test or not, if they have the right paperwork for the kind of losses that they claim to have suffered. Now, insurers will rant and moan about this situation, and they'll say, we're so vulnerable, we are at risk of being cheated all the time by merchants, but fundamentally the system works. If it doesn't, you can, more common than out and out fraud is people working in gray areas, things that they're not sure their insurer would have really wanted them to do. People do take each other to state courts, and that it's an extremely lucrative line of law. So the insurance business spawns insurance lawyers, who are some of the most well-paid lawyers in early America. I said this to other groups, but if you watch Hamilton, when Hamilton comes out in Act 2 with his new fancy green velvet blazer, it's not a blazer, whatever it is, I can't remember the word now, but his coat, that coat is fancy because of money he makes as an insurance lawyer. Hamilton's on retainer to one of the big New York insurance companies, and he's making that way. So lawyers manage this, their reputation manages this, expertise manages this, and also they sometimes sort of go to arbitration, and sometimes they just sort of negotiate these gray areas with one another because they would prefer to continue to do business with one another. So frauds do happen, but in general, the system's like pretty robust, and there are a bunch of different stages in the process where things can be checked.
Okay. Now we have a more general question. If you could, one of our viewers is asking, would you please describe a typical insurance transaction? Who pays who and when and under what circumstances?
Sure. So this is the beginning, the prologue of my book, tells this whole story. And I probably should have started this talk with that. But basically, you would write a letter to an insurance company, or you'd go into the office and you'd describe your vessel and describe the voyage, not at great extent. They're not kicking the tires that carefully, because generally, if they believe that you're legit, again, most of the risk is political, or maybe it's about hurricane season too. They want to, I suspect that people sort of sized each other up in also sort of cultural fashion. If they don't know you, is there somebody who is vouching for you? Are you connected to us in some ways? But anyway, you go in, you describe your potential voyage. The company will take this information, and then there's a sort of a quick informal vote by whoever's working in the office that day about whether to accept the policy. If it's a bigger issue, they might take a little more time and involve a few more of the company directors. So the company directors are the ones who are deciding, like a subcommittee of them, like in any given day, is deciding what risks to accept, or sometimes they have to have a bigger meeting if it's a bigger venture, and they decide what insurance rate they're going to offer you. So they send you the policy, you pay not with cash on the spot, but you basically pay with an IOU. And your IOU is structured so that it comes due after your ship is supposed to have come in. So people often get longer times to pay if they're doing like an East Indies voyage than if they're doing a sort of a Boston to South Carolina kind of voyage and back. So the insurance company then has your note, your IOU. They put it in the bank until it comes due, and then you have your policy. And then if there's then you have to come in and pay at the time that you're supposed to pay. Or if you have a claim, you have to let them know about the claim. They have to do an examination of your papers and think about what happened. And that can either be a very quick process, or I've seen these processes go on for years if there's litigation involved. And then once they make a decision, they're supposed to pay you out within 60 days. So that's the gist of the transaction. If they're not incorporated, if it's just an insurance broker, you would go to the broker, write him a letter, and he would wrangle together a group of underwriters who would sort of collectively agree to each take a piece of your risk. Like one of them might say, oh, you want $1,000? Here's one guy who'll take 200 of that. Here's another guy who will take 300, and so on. And the broker decides the rate, which sometimes needs to be negotiated if the underwriters balk. But often these are pretty coordinated working groups of experienced underwriters who let the brokers make decisions for them. They sort of let stuff roll. So some of the brokers operate effectively more like companies than we would necessarily imagine.
Okay. Now, take an event of the American Revolution, say like the Boston Tea Party. What was, how did insurers handle major, that event in particular, or, other events like it? If you,
So I spent a lot of time
or like the
actually trying to
Jacks
figure
Bay
out.
in 1772, or
I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what happened in the Boston Tea Party, and I think I can't remember now, but I think the East India Company was at that point self-insured, so a loss was a loss was a loss.
right.
American insurers are smaller operations for the most part, although they're still big money, but often an insurance company won't cover the whole risk of one huge voyage. They might take a piece of it, and then another company will take another piece of it, and so on. So there are groups that handle the risk of single major ventures. They do get in trouble when, I guess, the political disaster that they would face is when unpredictable local conflict becomes like out and out war. Insurers do really well in uncertainty before war. They can often stay alive during wartime. Again, high risk, high reward. You can get wiped out. You might want to hedge your bets. And then insurers tend to get in trouble actually when wars end, when they have to pay these giant wartime claims all at the same time, but they're now only able to charge peacetime premiums. So that's kind of a bummer for them when wars come to an end. But yeah, they're concerned about moments when suddenly there is a lot of political risk, and that's what makes them a business that is motivated to communicate extensively with politics, and to offer their opinions, and sometimes during this period to request indemnification. So there are two sets of legal cases that go on after the Napoleonic Wars, after the French Revolutionary Wars, really, that go on and on. That's about merchants trying to get the U.S. government to indemnify them for certain losses during the wars. And a lot of the claimants on the US government are actually insurance companies, which paid out to merchants who lost ships. And they're like, well, we suffered losses. And so there's some people sometimes like raise questions about this, like, yeah, you're the insurance company, you suffered losses, but that's like your job, and you made money on the upside too, guys. But in general, like, they were able to, again, like I said, convince the government that they are American institutions as deserving of indemnification as any others. And again, because there's not like a political faction that's particularly motivated against insurance companies to stop insurance companies. So they do get a big chunk of change back from the federal government through these like indemnification claims. So these are the kinds of things that happen when big disasters strike all at once.
Okay. That's a good lead into the next question. What would the typical return be for insurers on transactions, or a typical contract where nothing bad happens and the insurance comes out ahead?
Yeah, so war and peace, huge difference. Peacetime, insurance policy is just a couple of percent, so that's how much they're, that's the scale of the premium that comes in, and some insurers prefer that climate. During war, there is no typical. So insurance companies, like I said, if you remember that slide I had of the dividends from insurance companies, those really reflect the sort of boom and bust in any given year, where some years the insurance company is returning 40% of its share price as dividend to shareholders because they just made so much on premiums they charged for war risks, but then the ships didn't get captured, they didn't have to pay out. So a year, through this, what I would demarcate like through the early 1790s through 1815, dividends of 20-30% a year are not uncommon. They're not dependable. You can't count on that. They're quite high. And so another Hamilton story like this, a wealthy widow writes to Hamilton at one point and is like, well, what should I invest in? She's got this money. There are in American financial markets now, so there are things to buy. She's like, well, what's good out there? And he's like, you should have some insurance company stock. You should also have some government securities, because you want to balance like your fluctuating returns with your steady returns. That's a good combination to have. So it's the unpredictability of that return that makes it interesting. But I'd say like peacetime 2%, wartime 20-30%.
Okay. Now there was one question at the beginning from one of our viewers who is currently doing his own research. He asked, how far down did the urban hierarchy were insurance companies established? For example, he says, he's doing a lot of research on the history of Alexandria, Virginia, and which was closely connected to Philadelphia. But firms in Alexandria received little attention.
I don't quite understand how far down the urban hierarchy were they established. So there are everywhere. There's a port city. There's a little insurance company. All the New England towns have them.
Obviously, Philadelphia is going to get more attention, than
There is an article on insurance in Alexandria. Mr. Dahmen, if you email me, I'd be happy to send it to you. So they are often understood as part of these local port city ecologies. It's towns that often have a bank or two, a little insurance company or two. Usually local, it has to be experienced merchants with capital. Those are the only people who can found insurance companies. Other people can buy shares, other people can be part of the project, but they have to be run by folks with time and experience and capital enough to get the business started. And they have to be not on the political outs, because they have to be able to get their incorporation that gives them this sort of legal security, gives them this cultural imprimatur, that allows them to invest their capital more efficiently and securely as well. So I think, again, that is part of an interesting part of the US story, is that it's so different from say London, where the marine insurance business becomes concentrated in two mega corporations, but really at Lloyd's of London, this giant insurance clearinghouse. And in the United States, it's really, it's a business that's biggest in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, but is genuinely one of these robust piles of capital in other towns as well, in Charleston, in New Orleans. As soon as there's a British North American New Orleans, there's insurance there. Once the United States comes in, even as a territorial governor. So when there are waterways, there are insurance companies ranging from little to big, and their charters look like one another, because once you have one successful template, that's what everybody's going to be. What I think is interesting about some of these little towns is where banking and insurance are done through the same corporation. And sometimes there's a couple of places in New Jersey that are chartered to be banks and insurance companies. Insurance companies are also crypto banks in ways that I can talk about in more detail, but they're to some degree in the business of lending. And was I saying local insurance? Oh, and there's a couple of places where banks are considered politically unsavory, but prospective founders are able to charter insurance companies instead, and then they kind of operate them like banks. Anyway, there's a Kentucky insurance company issues its own banknotes. It's a bank, but it could have done insurance too. I didn't get into its archives, so I'm not totally sure, but I have seen its banknotes.
Sure. And that's another good lead in to one of our last questions. Are any of the early insurance companies still in existence?
Yes, actually, there are a few. The one that I worked with most closely is now Chubb. It was the Insurance Company of North America, which is the first joint stock insurance company founded after the revolution, really. And they became Cigna, and then they became Chubb. And so the work that I did there, I had to get vetted by their lawyer to make sure, that it was legit. So it's actually it's easier to work with papers from these earliest corporations, and then actually a lot of the mid 19th century corporate records have been lost. That just the corporations go in and out of existence faster, and they're not required to do this reporting, and they're not sort of tied into the lives of prominent early Americans the way that the early companies are. So a lot of the very early company papers get saved because they're associated with prominent early American elites whose papers get preserved in historical collections. So they're like, oh, sure, we'll take the insurance stuff too, I guess. But later on, it's actually more work remains to be done. So if anyone wants to come to grad school and work on it, let me know.
All right. Well, Dr. Farber, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. I want to thank you very much for your great presentation. It's a little known aspect of the American Revolution that deserves a little bit more attention. I think you did it justice. So thank you. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us this evening. It's greatly appreciated. And I hope this offers some incentive to our viewers to go out and purchase your book if they haven't already.
Thank you very much. There we
There
go. I got mine too.
go.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I really
Absolutely. Now, before we conclude tonight's program, I'd like to point out that as you all leave tonight, there will be a Google Form survey that will appear on your screen. We kindly ask that you share your thoughts about this evening's program, as well as any suggestions you have for other topics that you would like us to cover in future programs. As always, your feedback is most helpful as we develop our future programming calendar. Leading into that, I would also like to invite you to visit the events page on our website, AmericanRevolutionInstitute.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming historical programs. Our next historical program this month is a lunch bite that will be held on Zoom virtually Friday, January 21st at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it will feature a presentation given by our museum collections and operation manager, Paul Newman, who will be discussing a portrait of British General Sir William Green, an engineer who was instrumental in designing the British defenses of Gibraltar. Registration is open for that currently, as well as all of our other future historical programs. So with that, on behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, thank you all for joining us this evening and for your continued support of our mission. I'd like to wish you all a great evening and good night. So
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.
take care. Good night.